Hi, my name is Lydia, and on the night of my husband's grand birthday banquet, while guests toasted him with champagne and my mother-in-law beamed in diamonds, she leaned over, smiled sweetly, and whispered loud enough for the room to hear, "You're nothing but a leech living off this family." People laughed. They laughed at me. And as I sat there, frozen, even Eudora, my frail grandmother-in-law, was ignored as she silently signed for help. I wanted to disappear, but instead, I stood. And what happened next? It wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, it was silent, deadly silent. Because in just a few hand signs, spoken in the one language they all refused to learn, I exposed a 20-year-old secret and tore the truth wide open. What was hidden? Why did they fear that silence so much? And what did they try to erase from our family's past? You'll see, but not everyone walked out of that banquet the same. Before we begin, where are you watching from and what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments below. Let's dive in. I stepped out of the town car into the warm Houston night, the air thick with the smell of magnolia and gasoline. The valet took the keys before I had a chance to say thank you. For a second, I just stood there, looking up at the hotel's glowing glass facade. Inside, the ballroom glittered like a jewelry box spilled open. Crystal chandeliers hung heavy over the tables, catching the light like frozen rain. People were already laughing, glasses clinking, the sound muffled by the doors. My husband Virgil's birthday banquet, Minerva's production. She always knew how to make a statement. I'd spent the last 2 days quietly helping with the details, calling florists, confirming the seating chart she'd sent out at the last minute. I never expected to be thanked. I just wanted things to go smoothly. It's how I've always been. Even tonight, I'd chosen a simple navy dress, nothing flashy. As I walked in, the maitre d' gave me a polite smile, the kind reserved for staff. The ballroom was massive, lit with golden light that made everyone look richer, younger, more certain of their place. I felt the opposite. At the center table, Minerva sat like a queen in a silver gown, bracelets stacked up her arm, her voice carrying over the string quartet. Virgil stood beside her, shaking hands, his smile fixed. Around them, the family clustered close, siblings, cousins, business partners, all dressed to match the room's opulence. A young hostess appeared at my elbow. "Mrs. Bennet, this way." She led me not toward the center, but along the far wall, past the kitchen door and the waitstaff's station. My table was tucked near a column, half hidden by a giant fern. A clear view of the emergency exit. It wasn't lost on me that every other spouse sat near their partner, front and center. I slid into the chair, my palms slick. From here I could see everything. The laughter, the toasts, Minerva's diamond smile. Nobody saw me, except when their eyes flickered over with a quick, pitying glance. I heard a woman at the next table murmur, "Isn't that Virgil's wife?" And another whisper, "Poor thing." My face burned. I pressed my hands together in my lap and stared at the tablecloth, a starched white that felt like paper under my fingers. A bell chimed lightly as a waiter refilled glasses. Minerva rose, her sequined gown catching the light like knives. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice filling the room through the microphone. "Tonight we celebrate my son, Virgil, the man who built this family's legacy with his hard work and vision." She paused, eyes sweeping the room. "And may he never be dragged down by those who only feed off our generosity." Laughter rippled through the tables like an electric current. She didn't say my name. She didn't have to. Every head turned just slightly in my direction. Someone at the front chuckled louder, a high, mean sound. My fingers tightened around the edge of the table until my knuckles hurt. I forced my face into neutrality, the same mask I've worn for years. Inside, though, something broke. For a long time, I've stayed quiet for the sake of peace. telling myself it was easier to let the insults roll off. But tonight, the air felt different, thicker, heavier, like a storm building. Their laughter wasn't just noise, it was a blade turning. I watched Virgil laugh along with his mother, lifting his glass, not once looking my way. I thought of all the nights I'd stayed up balancing our household accounts, of the calls I'd made to smooth over his mistakes, of the sacrifices I'd made quietly. And here I was, a prop in their show. A movement at the edge of my vision caught me. Delia, Minerva's own mother, sat at a small table nearby. Frail, shoulders drawn, her hands moved slowly in sign language, trying to get Minerva's attention. No one noticed. I felt her touch under the table, her fingers brushing mine, light as a whisper. A silent plea. The only acknowledgement I'd received all evening. I looked at her, at the sorrow in her eyes, and for the first time in years, my own gaze hardened. Their laughter rose again, louder this time, but under it a thought began to form. This was only the beginning of the humiliation they had planned for me. I didn't look away. Even as the laughter thickened like smoke, I kept my eyes on Eudora. She sat just a few chairs down, barely visible behind the towering centerpiece of orchids and floating candles. Her frame was so slight, nearly swallowed by the oversized gold chair she sat in. The sleeves of her cardigan, pale blue with tiny pearl buttons, shook as her hands moved in slow, uncertain signs. She was trying to say something. Her mouth formed silent syllables, her hands trembling as they shaped letters only a few in this room could understand. Fewer still cared to. It was a plea, one made quietly, almost apologetically. I doubted anyone else even noticed. They were too busy sipping champagne, too invested in the performance Minerva had staged. But I noticed. I watched her eyes search the crowd, the desperate flicker in them as she realized no one was looking her way. Not Minerva, not even Virgil. To them, she was just a fixture, something that had to be there, like the flower arrangements or the cake. I wasn't much different. I sat still, my breath slow, controlled. Her silence was one of biology, age and illness. Mine? I'd chosen it. Or maybe I'd let it be chosen for me. Years of telling myself to let things go, to keep peace, to not make a scene. But in that moment, I felt it. The link between us. Two women sidelined, dismissed, one by time, the other by design. Someone across the table shifted their chair. The scrape of the leg against the marble snapped my attention back. A man I didn't recognize, late 40s maybe, wearing a velvet blazer that screamed old money, leaned forward, swirling his whiskey glass lazily. "You must be her," he said, a smirk curling at the edge of his mouth. I blinked. "Excuse me?" "You know, the wife, the one everyone whispers about." He chuckled, tipping his glass toward me. "Didn't expect you to be so quiet. You're like the family's well-dressed ghost." A few heads turned. The woman next to him let out a tight giggle, then looked away, pretending she hadn't. Another snorted into her drink. I could feel it, the momentary spotlight, the mocking, the ridicule dressed up in pleasantries. I smiled, but it was hollow. Just enough to keep things from tipping over. He wasn't family. He didn't even know me. But somehow he felt entitled to join the game, to laugh along with them. That was the real sting. How easily strangers stepped into the role Minerva had carved out for me. I glanced toward the head table. Minerva caught my eye. For the briefest second, I saw her mouth curve. Not a smile, not exactly. It was satisfaction. She didn't have to say a word. She'd orchestrated this. I turned back to my plate. The food had grown cold. I wasn't hungry anyway. A soft movement near my side pulled my attention again. Eudora. Her hand had slid toward me, fingers barely lifting from her lap. Her gestures had lost form now, growing more frantic, scattered. Her eyes, locked on mine, pleading, not just to be seen, but to be understood. Without thinking, I reached under the table and grasped her hand. It was delicate, almost weightless, like holding pressed silk. She looked surprised at first, then something settled in her face. Relief, maybe. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened. I squeezed her hand gently, not for show, not for anyone else, just for her, and maybe for me too, because in that brief contact, I found something I hadn't felt all evening. Presence. Not theirs. Mine. My own choice. My own decision to acknowledge her, to say without words, I see you. You're not invisible to me. The noise around us continued. Forks clinked, glasses clashed, laughter spiked at inappropriate volumes. But inside me, something shifted. I could feel it. Not rage exactly, but something steadier, like a thread pulling taut. For too long, I'd mistaken patience for peace. Tonight, their mockery wasn't just cruelty, it was permission. A signal to everyone in this room that I could be ridiculed without consequence. And if I let that pass, it would be the same tomorrow, and the day after that. I glanced down at Eudora's hand, still resting in mine. She, too, had spent years being overlooked, forgotten, pushed to the corners of this family's gatherings, like a vase nobody remembered to refill. Yet here she was, reaching out in the only way she could. A few seconds passed. I let go of her hand gently, returning mine to my lap. The air hadn't changed, the temperature hadn't shifted, but something in me had begun to stir. And as I sat there, surrounded by the clinking of cutlery and the distant hum of laughter, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't about just tonight. They'd been erasing me long before I ever stepped foot in this ballroom. The lights dimmed just as dessert plates were being cleared. The sudden hush rolled through the room like a soft breeze. A flickering blue glow replaced the golden warmth of the chandeliers, and all eyes turned to the giant screen that had descended behind the head table. The MC's voice rang out, cheerful and polished. And now, a little surprise from the family, a walk down memory lane for our beloved Virgil. People clapped. Chairs shifted as everyone turned to get a better view. Someone near me let out a whistle. I sat still, fingers loosely knotted in my lap, heart pounding in a rhythm I couldn't control. I already knew what was coming. I didn't need to see the screen to feel the sting of it. The opening notes of a piano version of What a Wonderful World played over a montage of childhood photos. There was Virgil as a toddler, smeared in birthday cake. Then him at Little League, mid-swing. A shot of him with braces, awkwardly standing next to his siblings on a beach I remembered clearly because I was there too. Except I wasn't. My breath caught. The caption under the photo read, Summer Trip, Galveston 1999, Minerva and her kids. I stared at the screen, waiting to see myself pop in at the edge, maybe cropped, maybe half-turned. But I wasn't in the frame at all. The pictures moved on, holidays, graduations, weddings. So many moments I remembered vividly, moments I lived. I remembered the camera flashes, the poses Minerva forced us into, the rehearsed smiles. And yet, I wasn't in any of them. I whispered to myself, they didn't just forget, they removed me. My name never showed up in a single caption. Even photos I knew had originally included me were artfully zoomed or replaced with others. Entire chapters of Virgil's life that I had walked beside him were rewritten, as if I'd never been there, as if I'd never mattered. I looked around the room, wondering if anyone else noticed, but people were smiling, nodding along. Minerva dabbed at the corner of her eye with a monogrammed napkin. Virgil had his arm around her shoulder. A show. Always a show. I glanced to my left. Eudora's eyes were fixed on the screen, but her expression was unreadable. Her hands lay motionless in her lap, limp and folded. I wondered if she saw what I saw, or if she was too used to it by now to even react. When the video ended, the room erupted in applause. The lights rose again slowly, bathing the tables in soft light once more. I blinked, trying to collect myself. My palms were damp, clenched tight. Then I heard a voice, low but sharp. "Hey," someone said, leaning slightly toward me. It was Brielle, a cousin on Virgil's side, one of the younger ones. She wore a dress that probably cost more than my mortgage. "At least you dressed up this time," she said with a smirk. "Not as cheap as usual." She giggled softly and turned back to her table before I could react. Someone beside her stifled a laugh, and I felt a dozen eyes flick toward me, then away. It was a hit-and-run insult, one she'd get away with because it was delivered with sugar on top. I sat still, smile tight, nails digging into my palms so hard I half expected to bleed. I wasn't surprised. It wasn't the first time, but it cut anyway. All I could think was, how many times had they done this? Rewritten me out, talked over me, ignored me at gatherings, skipped my name in invites, left me out of the family newsletter Minerva sent every December. Even our wedding photo, framed at their house, was carefully cropped to leave out my mother and brother. The quiet erasures weren't accidents. They were strategy, and I had let them do it. My chest ached with something deeper than sadness. Grief, maybe. Not just for what I was losing, but for what I had already lost and hadn't even realized. Pieces of me that had been chipped away for so long, I no longer noticed the gaps. I turned my head slightly and caught Eudora looking at me again. Her fingers moved slowly, signing words I couldn't fully read, but I understood the intent. There was sorrow in her gestures, and frustration, maybe even guilt. We were two ghosts sitting side by side at a banquet meant for the living. That recognition, silent, mutual, made something settle in me. Not peace, no, but clarity. They wanted me invisible, even in memory. But I was still here, still breathing, still watching. I picked up my water glass and took a sip, letting the coolness wash over the fire building in my chest. My face gave nothing away, but inside I felt a shift. They had deleted me from the slideshow, skipped my name, mocked my dress. But I wasn't done. And that night, as my name vanished from their memories, I felt the first spark of something I had never dared before. A warning forming inside me. The applause faded into casual chatter, the clink of utensils and fresh pours of champagne. Waiters moved like shadows, clearing plates with practiced grace, while laughter started to bubble again at the head table. The slideshow was over. The message had been sent, loud and clear. My existence was optional. I stayed still in my seat, back straight, chin just slightly lifted. I didn't fidget, didn't sip from my glass, didn't even look at Virgil. I sat in deliberate silence, every part of me alert. I wasn't sulking. I was observing, absorbing. Voices grew louder as the next phase of the evening began. Speeches. Minerva's eldest son, Blaine, stood first, tapping his glass like he was at a political rally. "Let's raise our glasses, folks," he called out, "to the woman who built this family from grit and pearls, to Minerva." Another wave of clapping. A few guests whooped. I saw a server flinch at the sudden volume. "One toast won't do," someone else shouted. "She deserves 5. One by one they stood. Nephews, nieces, a business partner I barely recognized. Each took a turn painting a portrait of devotion, legacy, power. No one mentioned kindness, no one spoke of generosity. And yet, the room hung on every word. Virgil eventually stood, sliding his chair back slowly like he'd rehearsed it. "Mom," he said, raising his flute. No man could have asked for a more determined, more loyal force in his corner. "You've shaped who I am." I watched him. His voice was steady, sure. He knew exactly where he stood, in the center of her design. I stayed seated. My glass, still full, shimmered under the light. I didn't reach for it. Then came a voice from across the table, too loud, too casual to be unintentional. "Lydia, you're not joining in. It's your husband's night." I turned slowly toward the woman who said it. Meredith, one of Minerva's lifelong friends, polished and sharp-tongued. She was grinning, but it didn't reach her eyes. I rose to my feet, calm, slow. I picked up my glass, let it hover just a breath from my lips. My voice didn't waver. "To memories," I said, looking not at Meredith, not at Minerva, but out into the room, that never fade, even when people try so hard to erase them. The air shifted. A few guests exchanged glances. One man cleared his throat. There were smiles, yes, but unsure ones. Not everyone understood the barb, but those who did, their silence was telling. I sat back down without sipping. Minerva laughed, one of those quick, brittle laughs that was more sound than joy. She stood up next, adjusting her shawl like a queen about to deliver a decree. "Well," she said, voice sweet and sharp, "don't take Lydia too seriously. She's always been sensitive. Honestly, she's lucky to be here at all. None of this would exist without Virgil's hard work. We all know who the real contributors are." She let that hang a beat before finishing it off, with a smirk. "Let's just say not everyone gets to live this life. They just tag along." The room erupted, not with shock, but with amusement. Laughter, soft and stinging, swept over me like a wave of smoke. It didn't burn right away, it choked slowly. My vision blurred for a second, not with tears, but with heat. I didn't flinch. I didn't give her the pleasure of a reaction. I simply sat, frozen, my smile faint, fixed. I looked at Virgil. He didn't look back. His face was a mask, expressionless, safe. Neutrality was his survival skill, and I realized then it had always been mine too, but not tonight. Around me, the room swirled. Voices carried, faces laughed, and none of it touched me. It was like watching a party through a pane of glass. Inside, something broke open, not loud, not explosive, just a crack deep enough to let the light in. I leaned slightly toward Eudora. Her hand, delicate and spotted with age, trembled on the edge of the table. She was signing again, slow, urgent movements. No one noticed her. No one ever did. I reached under the table and took her hand in mine. She squeezed. That was it. Just a squeeze. But it felt like an anchor, the only one I had. I closed my eyes briefly. My mind replayed Minerva's words. Sensitive, along for the ride, a leech. No one stood up for me. No one pushed back. My own husband didn't blink. I opened my eyes. They think humiliation is power, that silence is weakness, but they've mistaken my silence for submission. They think I've been watching from the sidelines because I'm afraid. They're wrong, I whispered to myself, barely moving my lips. They think humiliation is power, but power can be undone. And for the first time all evening, I smiled. Not a tight, forced smile, but one that curled at the edge with something sharper. This wasn't the end. It was the start of a different story, one I'd write myself. I didn't speak. I didn't have to. The damage had already been done, and somehow that silence, my silence, felt sharper than anything I could have said. The ballroom lights had dimmed slightly again, not as part of the program, but with the natural winding down of the evening. Candles flickered lower. A few guests had started wandering toward the bar or resting their feet near the back. The air was thick, not just with perfume and champagne, but with something else, something unspoken. Tension, maybe. Or expectation. I stayed at the table, barely moving. The laughter from Minerva's speech still echoed somewhere in my chest, lodged deep. My knuckles still bore faint half-moons from where my nails had dug in. They called me a leech, a parasite. A woman a few seats down laughed again, at something unrelated, probably. But the timing was cruel. My ears caught every sound too clearly now, like my body had gone into defense mode. I needed out. I stood, murmured something vague about needing air, and slipped away before anyone could stop me. The hallway just beyond the ballroom was quiet, dimly lit, lined with ornate mirrors and heavy velvet drapes. It felt colder there, removed from the show inside. My heels echoed slightly as I stepped toward a quiet alcove where a few chairs had been pushed aside. I sank into one, tucked into the shadows, away from view. And that's when it hit me. Not loud, not sudden. It was a slow, crushing pressure in my chest. Like every insult, every overlooked moment, every rewrite of who I was, finally caught up to me. I clenched my jaw, trying to breathe steadily, but the rhythm was broken, shallow and quick. I gripped the edge of the seat. My throat tightened and my eyes burned, not from tears yet, but from the effort it took not to fall apart completely. A distant voice, half familiar, floated by. "Always so dramatic," someone muttered, passing through the corridor with a plate in hand. They didn't even notice me sitting there. Or maybe they did and just didn't care. I pressed my back against the wall, cool and firm behind me. "Don't fall," I whispered to myself. "Not here, not now." But it was already too late for pretending this didn't hurt. I don't know how long I stayed like that, still, hunched slightly, arms folded like a makeshift armor. Long enough that my breathing finally slowed, long enough for the fog in my mind to start thinning. And then I heard Virgil's voice. "Lydia!" I didn't look at him right away, just kept staring forward, eyes unfocused. He stepped closer, keeping his tone low, like he was comforting a frightened child. "You okay?" I turned my head slowly. "Am I okay?" He sighed. "You're overreacting. Mom didn't mean it like that. You know how she gets at these things. She's just theatrical." I blinked. He wasn't trying to apologize. He was trying to contain me. "You think I'm overreacting?" My voice came out level, almost too calm. "She was joking. You know her sense of humor? It's sharp, sure, but it's not personal." "She called me a parasite," I said quietly. He looked annoyed now. "She didn't use that word." I stared at him, astonished, not by his defense of her, but by how practiced it sounded, like he'd rehearsed it. Maybe he had, over years of letting these moments pass. "Virgil," I said, my voice low, "you didn't even look at me when she said it, when the room laughed." He rubbed the back of his neck, eyes shifting to the side. I didn't want to make it worse. And just like that, I knew. This wasn't about avoiding conflict. This was about preservation. His, not mine, not ours, his. He stepped back as if washing his hands of it and returned toward the ballroom. I sat still for a moment longer, the ache in my chest dulling into something else, familiar, heavy, and cold. It wasn't just tonight. I'd lived this before, in quieter ways, in polite rejections, in forgotten invitations, in family pictures where I stood behind everyone else, cut off by a poor crop or an intentional one. I thought of Eudora, how her hands had signed for help, again and again. No one listened, no one cared to learn what her fingers said, and that's when something shifted. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a slam of fists against the wall. It was quieter than that, but just as final. My tears stopped. My hands steadied. They've mistaken quiet for weakness. But silence. Silence can be tactical. If they won't hear me when I speak, maybe they'll notice me when I speak differently. I thought of Eudora's hands again. How they spoke without sound. How she reached me always, without ever raising her voice. Maybe I didn't need to shout. Maybe I needed to speak in the one language they'd refused to learn. I stood, fixed the drape of my shawl, and walked back toward the ballroom. The music had started up again. A slow, jazzy number now, meant to lull the guests into softer conversation as the night crept toward its end. I passed servers, I passed whispers, but no one looked twice. I moved like a ghost, like I always had. But this time I didn't feel invisible. I felt focused. As I approached our table, I caught Eudora's eyes. She was watching the doorway, waiting. When she saw me return, she smiled, not wide, but knowing. I sat beside her, rested a hand on hers again. She signed something, her movements slow but firm. I didn't respond right away, but I understood. I was done being erased, and if silence was the only thing they'd ever allowed me, I'd make sure it carried weight they couldn't ignore. I sat back down slowly, smoothing the napkin over my lap as if nothing had changed, as if the earth hadn't tilted beneath me just an hour earlier. My heart was quiet now, too quiet, like the moment just before a storm. The ballroom had thinned. The drunkest guests had either disappeared or grown louder at the bar. Those still seated were either half engaged in whispers or fidgeting with the last bits of dessert. Clinking forks and low chatter filled the space. But beneath it all, I could hear something sharper, restlessness, the kind that ripens into cruelty when the night drags too long. I kept my eyes on the silverware, but my senses were alert. Every laugh still felt personal. Every glance, a measurement. I was done waiting for their validation. Minerva tapped her glass gently with the handle of her spoon. "We have one final moment to share," she said, her voice echoing again with that sickeningly smooth warmth that only meant danger. The lights dimmed slightly, but not fully. A small staff member stepped forward and handed Virgil a manila folder, gold-trimmed with the family crest. His expression was serious but practiced. He'd known this was coming. He rose, adjusted his jacket, and walked to the center of the room like he was receiving a medal. Someone even clapped before the announcement began. "This," Minerva said, placing a hand on his shoulder, "is to honor Virgil's leadership in our newest expansion, a bold step, a family vision." Applause rippled around the room. I stayed seated, my hand froze on my glass, because I recognized that folder, the layout, the formatting, the margin notes in pale blue ink. I'd written that contract, weeks of research, meetings, back and forth edits. Virgil had dumped the entire project on me during one of his out-of-town stretches. I'd spent nights bent over that document at the kitchen table while he slept upstairs. And now, my name was nowhere. No credit, not even a footnote. I pressed my palm to the table to ground myself. My fingers curled slightly against the fabric as I fought the urge to stand up, to scream. Minerva continued, voice dripping with triumph. "Every line of this deal bears the fingerprint of his brilliance." The words rolled over me like acid. Someone behind me whispered, "She should feel lucky, riding the coattails of this family." Another chimed in, too loudly. "Didn't even know she was part of the company. Guess she isn't." I didn't flinch, not outwardly. But inside, something broke open. They weren't just ignoring me anymore. They were scrubbing me out like a stain. Virgil stood there, smiling as he accepted the applause, basking in the recognition he hadn't earned alone. He didn't glance my way. He never did in moments like this. As people rose for a brief standing ovation, my chair remained still, cold. I heard a cousin's voice just a few feet away. Natalie, the one who once asked me if I was the help at a family. BBQ. "She's not clapping?" she snorted. "Maybe she's bitter she didn't get to pick the flower arrangements." Another round of soft laughter circled the table. I didn't blink. I didn't reach for my water. I didn't smile. Instead, I glanced across to Eudora. Her hands twitched gently in her lap, her fingers moving in small signs. Habitual now, like muscle memory. No one looked at her. not one person. But her eyes met mine, glass-like, reflective, trembling. She'd been silent for years, not because she didn't have something to say, but because they'd never bothered to learn how to hear her. And maybe that was the secret I hadn't understood until now. She had survived not in spite of her silence, but through it. It was the only armor she had. And now it would be mine. I leaned back in my chair, letting the heat in my chest settle into something denser, something sharper. They expected me to shout, to break, to cause a scene they could label as ungrateful, unstable, emotional. But I wouldn't give them that. I would give them silence that haunted, the kind of silence that demands to be understood without giving anything away. I traced the edge of my dessert plate absent-mindedly. My eyes fell again on the document in Virgil's hand. My work, my words, my name, buried in the footnotes, too small to see unless you knew exactly where to look. Good, let it be hidden now, because when it returns, it will return bold, unmissable. They thought they'd erased me with paper and applause, but all they'd done was press me deeper into the page. My fingers reached slowly toward Eudora's hand again. She flinched at first, surprised, then relaxed when I laced my fingers through hers gently. She signed something into our joined hands. Not loud, not dramatic, just 4 tiny signs. I see you. My throat tightened, but I didn't cry. I just held her hand tighter. They had all turned their backs on the language of hands. But I would speak it, and when I did, I'd make sure they listened. I stayed seated, still clutching my wine glass even though it had long gone warm. My other hand remained loosely draped over Eudora's, her fingers motionless now but full of unspoken encouragement. The room had shifted again. Most guests were still lingering, some circling back to desserts, others moving from table to table, catching up under the guise of polite small talk. But something in the air had changed, like the hush before lightning strikes. It wasn't loud, it was heavier, tighter. Artificial smiles, stifled yawns, and glances that darted too quickly away. They were waiting for something. So was I. I could sense Minerva's final play coming. She never left a battlefield without claiming every inch. Then it happened. A voice from the far end of the room, sharp, masculine, too rehearsed, cut through the noise. "Excuse me, everyone. I have something important to share." A man I barely recognized, some business affiliate who always reeked of cologne and ambition, stood holding a crisp white envelope. He held it above his head like it was some ancient decree. "I was asked to wait until the proper moment," he continued, "but this concerns the integrity of the family and the financial future of its legacy." The words were carefully chosen. Guests turned, murmurs building. He pulled out a printed document, shaking it once like a magician about to reveal a trick. There appears to be a pattern of withdrawals, funds redirected under a personal account, signed off by Lydia. The name dropped like a stone. Gasps, real or fake, echoed. I didn't move. "This is an early draft of an internal audit," he continued, "but the numbers are troubling." I caught Virgil's expression before he turned toward me. Pale, confused, or maybe pretending to be. "Lydia," he muttered, leaning close. "What is this? What did you do?" I didn't blink. "What do you think I did?" He didn't answer, just looked away. That told me everything. He already knew. This had been planned, rehearsed even. The false signature, the numbers manipulated just enough to raise eyebrows, but not enough to be disproved on the spot. I knew this strategy. I'd watched Minerva execute it on rivals, on friends, even family members who got in her way. You plant a seed of doubt. You water it with whispers. Then you step back and let it bloom. And here it was. Whispers spread like wildfire across linen tablecloths. "She always seemed off. Well, you know," She never really fit in. I heard she's been spending too much. That's why Minerva never trusted her. I sat still, completely still, my face neutral, my posture straight. But inside, something began to burn, not panic, not shame, but precision. This wasn't just character assassination, this was strategy, and they thought I wouldn't fight back. I reached under the table again, brushing Eudora's hand. Ixter squeezed it this time, not trembling, just firm. She looked at me and signed softly. Truth. Show them. The fire steadied. My heartbeat calmed. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to wave my arms or break glasses or beg someone to believe me. They wanted a scene. I wouldn't give them that. I'd give them something better. Slowly, I stood. A few noticed right away. Others fell silent as movement rippled outward, one table at a time, like dominoes tipping into stillness. No one said my name again. They just watched. Some curious, some afraid, most expecting a meltdown. Instead, I simply reached into my clutch and pulled out a folded paper of my own. Not a rebuttal, not a statement. Just a printed copy of that same contract Virgil had presented earlier, this one with version history visible at the footer. The crowd didn't understand what they were looking at, but Virgil did. His face stiffened. He knew what I was holding. Proof. Quiet, unimpeachable proof that the only person who understood the structure of the family's newest acquisition was me. That I had done the work. That I wasn't just a woman sipping wine in the corner. And I didn't say a word. I lifted the paper slowly, let it hang from my fingertips, then laid it gently in the center of the table. I wasn't handing it to anyone. Let them come get it if they dared. Then, with deliberate calm, I turned to Eudora. We locked eyes, and together, in silence, our hands began to move. Not frantic, not angry, just fluent, clear, the language they refused to learn. And now, it was the only one being spoken. For a moment, it was like the room forgot how to breathe. The only sounds were the soft rustles of dresses shifting in seats, the distant hum of the dessert station, and the nearly imperceptible sound of my hands moving through the air. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need their approval. They had spoken for me for years, rewriting my place, shrinking my worth, erasing my contributions one document, one lie at a time. But now, they had to watch. Watch as I signed the truth into the space between us. I moved slowly at first, shaping each word with intention. My fingers carried every detail Eudora and I had buried, details that now refused to stay hidden. The pattern of fraud, the dates when files were altered, the projects she led, credited later to someone else, the contracts I drafted that conveniently reappeared with her name omitted. At first, the crowd just blinked, unsure what they were seeing. A few tilted their heads. A couple leaned toward each other, confused. Then, Eudora stood. The room reacted with a stunned ripple as she pushed her chair back. Her fragile form, once ignored, now rose with a quiet strength that took my breath away. Her hands, though trembling, moved with me, in perfect sync. Our silence filled the room like thunder. Some began to understand, not the words, most didn't know the language, but the meaning, the cadence, the rage underneath our calm, the weight behind each motion. It wasn't performance, it was evidence. I glanced at Minerva. Her jaw was locked, eyes narrowed, scanning for some way to contain the damage. But this wasn't like before. She couldn't cut the mic or redirect the room with a speech. We weren't speaking in a way she could interrupt. A cousin leaned forward, whispering, "Is this real?" Another murmured, "I had no idea Eudora even signed anything." Then came the breaking point. Eudora reached into her handbag. From the folds of soft fabric, she pulled out a thick folder, edges yellowed but intact. She handed it to a server who passed it, stunned, to the table nearest Minerva. Inside, pages, dozens of them. Signed copies, originals, contracts, project files with timestamps, with my notes, and most importantly, with Eudora's initials clearly visible. The room exploded, not loudly, but in 100 directions. Gasps, murmurs, chairs shifting as people leaned closer. A nephew asked out loud, "Is this legit?" Another guest blurted, "This shows Eudora owned half the original equity." A woman across the room muttered, "Minerva lied." Minerva slammed her palm on the table. "You people are gullible. This means nothing." But her voice cracked, and when she looked toward Virgil, searching for backup, he hesitated. His hand hovered near hers, but he didn't touch her, didn't defend her. And that was when it all began to crumble, because the more she spoke, the more desperate she sounded, the more the crowd leaned away. People she'd kept under her thumb for decades now looked at her with suspicion. "What else have you hidden?" someone asked. Minerva turned toward me, venom in her voice. "You planned this. You and that invalid." And that did it. All the manipulation, all the years of suppression, theft, and belittling. It coiled up and snapped back. Because now the proof was on the table, and the one person she thought would never be heard was standing tall beside me. No one was laughing anymore. Even the ones who used to smirk now sat silently, unsure where to look. I felt a strange stillness settle into my bones. Not the tremble of fear, not the weight of grief. Something steadier. I looked at Eudora. Her fingers had stilled, but her expression said everything. For the first time in decades, her truth had been witnessed. And mine too. She nodded at me, almost imperceptibly. And I understood. This wasn't just about vindication. It was about power reclaimed. All those years, they told us silence was weakness. They never imagined we were choosing when to speak. I lowered my hands slowly. The room sat frozen. Minerva stared, speechless now. Virgil leaned back, eyes cast low. Some guests stood, unsure whether to offer comfort or distance themselves. No applause followed, no polite laughter tried to fill the vacuum, just stunned quiet. And in that hush, I felt something shift, not in them, but in me. I wasn't afraid anymore, not of being erased, not of being blamed, because I had already survived all of that, and come back louder than they knew how to hear. They built this family on secrets. We just brought the light, and now, the reckoning would begin. The hall felt colder than it had an hour ago. Crystal glasses, once gleaming, sat abandoned on white linen. The music had stopped somewhere in the middle of our revelation, and no one had dared turn it back on. Even the servers had retreated toward the kitchen, whispering nervously among themselves. I stood still, my hands at my sides, while the weight of everything I had signed into the air settled like dust across the room. Virgil was the first to break the silence. His voice wasn't loud, more like a hoarse whisper meant only for me, but swallowed by the heavy air. "You knew all this, all along." His eyes were wide, pupils dark with disbelief, but underneath that, I could see something else. Shame. I met his stare and nodded once. That was all it needed. No speech, no apology. Truth had already spoken louder than any of us. Minerva's voice cut through the hall next, trying to rise over the shifting chairs and muffled whispers. "This is absurd. She's twisted everything. You all know me. You know what I've built." Her words were sharper than before, but her tone cracked on the edges. For the first time in the years I'd known her, she didn't sound commanding. She sounded cornered. One of Virgil's cousins, a man who'd toasted Minerva only hours earlier, turned his head away from her. Another, a niece I barely knew, whispered, "Those signatures looked real." More papers passed from hand to hand, copies Eudora had kept safe all this time. The golden matriarch who had controlled every narrative now found herself surrounded by proof she couldn't spin. I didn't gloat. There was nothing satisfying in watching a person unravel, even one who'd spent decades undermining you. But the grim satisfaction of seeing truth hold its ground, that was undeniable. "Mother," Virgil tried again, his voice thin. "You need to stop." She whirled on him. "Don't you dare stand with her after all I've done for you." But her words hit an empty space. Virgil looked down at his shoes, his silence no longer shielding her, but exposing them both. Around us, the family had split into small knots. Some defended Minerva fiercely, muttering about loyalty and betrayal. Others demanded explanations, their faces tight with anger and confusion. The birthday banquet had dissolved into a trial, and the woman who once held court now stood accused in every glance. I realized then, with a strange clarity, that whether Virgil ever found the courage to stand beside me or not, I no longer needed his validation. The truth was bigger than our marriage, bigger than this room, bigger than all the years I had sat quietly on the edges of their tables. Eudora, exhausted but luminous, eased back into her chair. Her hand reached for mine and clasped it gently. For the first time, she was not invisible. Her truth had been seen, spoken, believed. She didn't need to fight anymore. I bent closer to her ear. "You did it," I whispered. "We did it." Her lips curved faintly, her eyes glistening. She gave my fingers a weak squeeze. I straightened up and let my gaze sweep the room. The chandeliers still glittered, but the glow felt harsher now, like light on broken glass. Faces I had known for years were drawn tight with shock. Some couldn't meet my eyes. Some looked at me with something like respect. I felt no urge to gloat, only a deep, aching relief. Silence had taught me something that night, that power can be built on lies, but it collapses under truth. That recognition may never come from those you love most, but you can still claim your worth without their permission. I knew scars would remain. Forgiveness might never come. But freedom had arrived. I released Eudora's hand gently, stood tall, and turned toward the exit. No one tried to stop me. No one called after me. The hall behind me murmured like a wounded animal, fractured by secrets it could no longer hide. Eudora rose slowly, leaning on her cane, and followed. We walked side by side toward the doors, two shadows moving through the wreckage of a dynasty built on silence. As we crossed the threshold, I felt the night air on my face, cool, clean, and heavy, with the scent of rain. The ballroom doors swung shut behind us, muffling the chaos. They tried to bury me in silence, I thought, glancing at Eudora. Instead, I made silence my voice. Because family secrets don't just end, they echo across generations. And mine had only just begun.